on your guard. There are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places of the world.
Everything out of the ordinary is to be reported.
Fiery the angels fell. Deep thunder rolled around their shores.
It may just be my imagination. Whatever it is that's watching, it's not human.
We are all now programmed for perfect happiness. Perfect happiness. Perfect happiness. Perfect happiness.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
It's a hard world for little things.
What we doing live? Echoes in eternity.
You know, there was a time in this country when smart people were considered cool. Well, maybe not cool, but smart people did things like build ships and pyramids, and they even went to the moon.
The Great Conjunction is the end of the world! Oh, the beginning?
It was a church. Do you know that word? Yes, there were still churches when I was a child.
But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light. For whatever makes manifest is light.
You now belong to God, no longer to the devil.
What you said just now is quite extraordinary.
You're listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina.
Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us here on Beyond Extraordinary. As always, this is Natalina, and I've got a really good show for you today. I know you're going to enjoy it. I had the privilege of talking to my dear friend and sister, Sharon Gilbert. She's a wonderful person. Many of you out there know her just from her work with PID Radio with the wonderful Derek Gilbert, her husband. Also, the many books that she has written, including her latest one that is a non-fiction book dealing with the Ebola crisis. Her book is called Ebola and the Fourth Horseman of the Apocalypse. It's a very timely book, and it is actually right up Sharon's alley, given her academic credentials as a scientist. So we talk about that. We talk about a lot of current events. We actually recorded the interview I think it was the day after the riots that took place, and yes, I'm calling them riots, in Ferguson, Missouri, and so that's been just about a week ago now, but it's still a worthy conversation. We talk about that a little bit, and then we get a chance to hear Sharon's story about her testimony and how she met Derek and how her life led her to where she is now, working with PID Radio and discussing all of this. So we'll call it like alternative news, as it might pertain to prophecy, etc. I think it is a really intriguing interview, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed talking to Sharon. She's lovely. She's multi-talented. She's just a dear heart, and you are in for a treat. So I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I sure did. Of course, my husband was here, and I invited my friend Angie over, and I made a turkey and stuffing and potatoes and made a big thing of bacon ranch pasta salad and gravy and all that good stuff. And Angie made a cake that was so good. It was just the three of us, and it was so nice. I wasn't able to get home this year, but it was really just a nice, good day and of fellowship and fun. We had a good time, so I hope you all did too, no matter what you did to celebrate that day. And I do want to say that on the heels of Thanksgiving, I am so thankful. You cannot imagine. I can't put into words just how thankful I am for all of you who faithfully listen to the show every time a new episode is released. For those of you who take links to the shows and share them on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, man, that just means so much to me. Those of you who engage in discussions about the subject matter of the show, those of you who have left feedback on iTunes and on Stitcher, that just means so much to me. I'm very, very thankful to all of you, because I know that there are a lot of podcasters out there, and there are a lot of websites out there. There's a lot of blogs out there that discuss issues similar to what I do. So for you to take the time out of your lives to not only listen to the show and read the articles that I write, but also to take that extra step and leave ratings and reviews and engage in discussion and share links, that is amazing. And a special shout out to those of you who have been so awesome as to donate to Extraordinary Intelligence. It is humbling and amazing and wonderful, and I don't even know how to thank you all so much. I want to give a special post-Thanksgiving shout out to my friend and colleague in this fringe Christian realm, Johnny Iron of The Iron Show. He was really a rock star to me this past week as I checked my mail, and to my surprise and delight and squeals of excitement, there was a wonderful Toshiba laptop that he sent me. It's a great machine. It works so wonderful. Johnny, if you're listening, I am so blessed by your friendship. Thank you so much for donating to this ministry, this wonderful laptop that I will make very, very good use out of. And it's good to be mobile. It's good to be able to take that laptop and get away from my computer desk here and wander out into other environments and do my work where it's a little quieter and a little bit better setup, and the machine is fast. It's just wonderful. Thank you, Johnny. And those of you who do not listen to The Iron Show, you should check it out. Johnny is still waiting to get his teeth fixed. We managed to, with the help of all of you wonderful folks out there, raise enough money to get him some replacement chappas. And so as soon as his mouth is fully healed, he's going to get some new teeth, and then he will be right back at it at ironshow.com. I'll put a link in the show notes, and of course I'll put links to all of Sharon's wonderful work in the show notes so that you can follow up with her. If there's anyone out there who doesn't listen to PID Radio yet, you really need to check it out. Definitely go through the links in the show notes and check out all of that wonderful stuff. So with all of that said, make sure the Christmas season is here, and I am going to be adding brand new inventory to my Extraordinary Boutique of all my handmade jewelry. That's coming tomorrow, and I'll be working all through the night to get that situated, and there will be lots of cool new stuff that I think you're going to like. ExtraordinaryBoutique.com. Follow me on Twitter. Follow me on Facebook. Check out my website, ExtraordinaryIntelligence.com. All the pertinent links are in the right-hand sidebar. Subscribe to the site. Subscribe to the newsletter. Oh, my goodness. You are awesome. So with all of that out of the way, let's just jump right into this great interview, if I do say so myself, with the one, the only, the multi-talented, the beautiful, and exciting Sharon Gilbert.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
I saw a pale horse.
The beast. We're told in the book of Revelation.
This is not a human child.
Isn't an angel Satan?
Armageddon is almost upon us.
Order the use of nuclear weapons.
The world is a fine place and worth fighting for.
From one end of the world to the other, I will oppose you.
They're here.
Welcome to the end of the world.
wrestling not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. This is PID Radio.
So some years back, when I was a brand new Christian, I struggled to find a place where I felt understood. Certainly, where I live is similar to where a lot of other people live, where there's churches on every street corner, but I still felt like a bit of an oddball. The things that interested me, like conspiracy, the supernatural, alternative news, these were things that were kind of impossible to strike up a conversation about in polite church fellowships. So, like a lot of people, I ended up going to the internet to see if I could find some like-minded folks, and then I happened upon Derek and Sharon Gilbert. I first found View from the Bunker, and I was drawn in by its catchy title, which Derek tells me he is credit 100% to his wife. But this quickly introduced me to the world of PID radio, and I thought, finally, these are my people. So while many of us know and love Sharon Gilbert from her work with her husband on PID Radio, I think it's important to note her incredible accomplishments in her own right. Sharon has a gift for writing, having authored a series of novels. She's contributed to a variety of compilations featuring Christian authors and scholars, and now having published her latest book, which is a non-fiction work titled Ebola and the Fourth Horseman of the Apocalypse. This highlights her skills as both a prophecy researcher and a credentialed scientist. On a personal note, Sharon has been an inspiration to me as a woman in this pretty male-dominated realm where we both work. Sharon has never apologized for her gender, but rather has proven through her academic achievements, her passion for Scripture, her dedication to the truth, and most importantly, her love for the Lord, that there is a place for us girls in this niche, that in fact, our voice is valuable and necessary. In my own journey, I've moved from an admirer of Sharon Gilbert to a colleague of Sharon Gilbert, and now, most importantly, I can call her my dear friend. This is why I'm so pleased to welcome the one and only Sharon Gilbert to Beyond Extraordinary. Sharon, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for coming.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. My head is so big right now. It's just monstrously big, and my earphones will no longer fit.
Well, I have been looking forward to having you on the show for quite some time, and I had the honor of interviewing Derek some months back. And, of course, he's your biggest fan. And he speaks so highly of you, and it's wonderful just to listen to your show and get to know you through the love that you and your husband have for one another and the passion for similar things through your podcasting and your writing and this type of thing. It's been really, really cool to see, and it's at such a wonderful example for people out there as they're listening. And I'm just so appreciative for what you do, and especially, like I said, there's just not very many women who do what you and now I do. There's just there's such a shortage of it, and I don't know, why do you think that is? Is it just sort of the history of people thinking that this is not a woman's place? What's this all about?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. I suspect that there are lots and lots of ladies out there who are just as interested in Bible prophecy as you and I are, that they are probably just as informed and studied as you and I are. For whatever reason, they're a little more quiet about it. They're not actually on the internet. I told you before we even started this thing that probably if I hadn't met Derek, I should say if the Lord hadn't brought me to Derek, because that's exactly what happened. He brought us together. Had that not happened, I probably wouldn't be doing this, because even though I have a background in entertainment, I sang for years, I sang gospel for years, I sang opera, I've done lots of stage work. I'm very comfortable in front of people as far as performing, but I'm a very quiet, introspective person by nature in reality. And I probably would not have put myself on the line like this were it not for my husband.
It's just amazing how the Lord works, because I can relate in a lot of ways. I very much, probably still to this day, consider myself an introvert, and hearing someone like yourself or me saying that, people out there might think, what? Because we put ourselves out there all the time through our shows and through our writing. But it is true. I held back for many years. When I first started my website, I always thought that eventually there would be a radio show to accompany it, because there's certain things that are just easier to communicate through this medium than, writing a 20-page essay that someone might not even read. Sometimes it's just easier to sit down in front of a microphone and just get your thoughts out. And so I always thought I was going to do it, and I just never did. And it wasn't until I became a Christian and I changed the focus of my website to a Christian worldview that I sort of overcame these confidence issues about doing a podcast, and then I actually went forward and decided to just try it. And so it's as with all things, it's just in His perfect timing. I hesitate to even try to imagine what kind of radio show I would have had if I would have started before I was a Christian. What kind of wacky information would I have been putting out there?
Well, I've been accused of putting out wacky information anyway.
That's true. That's true. I think we probably are both accused of that. But, before we get into the meat of our discussion today, I think it's so great. I want you to share the story of how you came to your faith and how that led you through your academic pursuits in biology, and ultimately how it manifested into the areas of interest that you discuss on PID Radio with your wonderful husband, Derek. Just tell us your story and how all of this came about.
Well, have you ever seen the movie Little Big Man?
I haven't.
Oh my, you really need to watch that. It's based on a book that is, I wish I could remember the name of the author, but he essentially wanted to write about history. He was a history buff, and he did it by inserting a character of his own into lots of different scenarios. Jack Crabbe was the name of the character, played by Dustin Hoffman. And Jack Crabbe is, as a youth, abducted by Indians, raised by Indians, and then meets his sister, who's a gunslinger, and then gets in with a whole bunch of gunslingers, and then ends up with Custer, and ends up having to fight the Indians. It's a really interesting movie, but one of the best lines is he keeps saying over and over, I was in my Indian period at that time. Or later on he'll say, I was now in my gunslinger period. And he goes through probably 7 different incarnations of himself throughout the movie. And sometimes I feel like I'm Jack Crabbe, because when I was a kid, I tell you what, Natalina, I remember being 3 or 4 years old. My earliest memories are of lying in the grass as a kid growing up in southern Indiana, looking up at the sky and talking to God. Just talking to Him like He's right there, real person, right in front of me. I had no problem, having a very personal conversation with Him. I knew Jesus was my Savior. I'd been told that by my aunt and uncle, by my parents, by lots of people, kin and my family, cousins. And I grew up in a rather large family, so getting off by myself was always sort of a wonderful time for me, because I had 5 sisters, and I was one of the youngest ones. So I often got sort of shoved to the side and ignored. But God was always there for me, no matter what. Now, at the same time, I was experiencing, I don't really know how to explain it other than to say that it was almost like I was seeing into another world sometimes. As a kid, I would see things or perceive things that clearly others did not. I remember one time when I was lying in my bed and I looked over at the wall in our bedroom, and it was a bedroom with 2 large double beds in the room, and one bed would belong to my parents. There was also a crib in there that I just recently graduated from because I had a younger sister now. And so I was sleeping over in the other double bed over by the wall. And I was alone in there for some reason. It was unusual. I must have just decided to go to bed early. But I was lying there and looking over at this far wall, and I saw people. And they were just like heads of people talking to me and talking to each other and making comments about whether or not I could see them and what sort of person I was. It was a really, really, really odd thing. Another time in the same room, I remember seeing my mother come in, and she was battling with snakes that were underneath my bed. And I asked Mom about it, and she said, "Honey, that never happened. That was a dream." But I know to this day that was not a dream. To me, that was something that took place in reality. There were, and my older sister, there were a few times when she said the same thing, that she would be able to see things. Now, my family comes from the eastern part of Kentucky. My parents they're both deceased now, both with the Lord, and I'm so grateful to know that they are with the Lord. They were very superstitious in their families down in the hills of Kentucky. They're from the Appalachians, an area that was very, very poor. And they had practically nothing, but they moved to southern Indiana to find a job there in Madison, Indiana. And that's why I ended up being born there. But I was raised like I was in Kentucky, because we often joked that Madison was like little Kentucky. They had these superstitions of banshees and ghosts and all sorts of otherworldly, supernatural, some might call it baggage, but I wouldn't really call it that. I think I would just call it an ancestry of being able to see things that perhaps others just don't perceive. But I never thought it unusual that I saw things like that. When I got older, even though I had in my own heart accepted Christ as my Savior at 3 or 4, my parents said I had to be 9 before I could actually go forward in church. So it was a revival meeting in August of 1962 when I finally got to go forward and tell the preacher what I'd known for all along, for most of my life. And from that point on, got baptized, and we were in a church that was an independent Baptist church. It had just switched over from a Southern Baptist to independent Baptist, and the preacher who came in shortly after I got baptized, in fact, no, he's the one who baptized me. He came in and he started teaching on Daniel and the book of Revelation. And as a 9-year-old, almost 10, I was fascinated by that. That hooked me. That totally hooked me on studying Scripture. And I stuck with that for a long time. But I went into my teenage years, especially toward, as I got closer to 20, I entered that sort of my rebellion period. You know how you get when you're a little older and you think, well, I don't know, these concrete things that, maybe there's more out there. And I got pulled into an occult world. I had friends that were doing seances and things like that. And because as a child I had seen things, I believed they were there. I had no problems believing it, and I'm pretty much convinced that they were not dead people come back to life, but they were things that you probably shouldn't have anything to do with. But it was alluring. So I can understand when kids today are drawn to the supernatural realm. It offers solutions and a camaraderie that, sadly, our churches today don't provide.
Right.
And so I got pulled away for a little bit. And that, as I was doing that, I started singing for my supper. I have been singing since I was a little kid, and I started singing in front of bands. And so we were performing at the Holiday Inn or the Ramada or whatever happened to be the place where, they had dance bands come in, and we do cover music. We'd sing the hits of the day. And I did that for several years. And one day I was so tired of doing that, and I was working in a band at night, and then during the day I was singing in a studio where we did commercial work and things like that. And Sandy Patty came by, and she did it to sing one of our commercials. I don't know if you're familiar with Sandy Patty.
Yeah.
She is this amazing person who was living in Indianapolis at the time where I was, and we called her in to do some work. She was doing a lot of studio work then, and we met and sort of hit it off and talked about the Lord, and she told me that she was just getting ready to go on tour with the Gaithers. She had her first album released, and they had helped her get that going, and so she was going out with them. And I said, well, stay in touch. Okay, well, she did. She called me one day, and she said, would you like to get out of the rut that you're in Indianapolis? Because I told her I was very unhappy. And she said, I've found out that a friend of mine is looking for someone to sing alto in his sort of youth road touring group, and a group that, of young people that go from churches all over the country. And I said, well, sure. And I ended up contacting Dave Clydesdale, who was the person she was talking about. And he and I hit it off, and I spent a year singing the solos and singing alto and the rest of the songs with Life Unlimited. And during that year, I got out of my rebellion period. Holy Spirit had been with me that whole time. That whole time I was walking away and trying to do things my way. The Holy Spirit pulled me back in and showed me that I could use my voice for His glory, for the glory of Jesus Christ. So I spent that year, and it was amazing getting to travel all over the country, in Canada, in the UK, singing for the Lord. I had told Him when I was a kid that I would be a missionary, and I believe in many ways that was my first step in a missionary journey that has continued now with PID Radio and the things that we do together, my husband and I. But that was the first step, and I'm so grateful that because of a chance meeting with Sandy Patty that I got to do that. So I did that, and then when I finished that up, got married and spent some time farming in Nebraska. When I was a kid, we'd been on a farm for quite a number of years, so I was familiar with that. And my ex-husband, he's a wonderful man. He loves the Lord, but he and I, it just was not meant to be. And sometimes that's how it works out. And sadly, our marriage didn't work, and after 8 years together, we split up, and that just broke my heart, because I really, he and I sang together and served the Lord together, and then I was convinced that by staying in a marriage that maybe wasn't the happiest, that somehow I was serving God. As I say, the marriage broke up, and that forced me to leave Nebraska and to go back to my home state of Indiana. I had been studying opera theater in Nebraska, and singing opera, had a great time, loved doing that. But that's a field of work that draws you into a lot of things that don't have Christ at the center at all. But oddly enough, while I was at the University of Nebraska, I was surrounded by this little cadre of Christians. When I moved to Indiana and decided that I was going to study pre-med, I got to Indiana University, and again, I was surrounded by this, just like they were coming like I was a magnet. And there were Christians everywhere, even though Indiana University, Bloomington University, is extremely liberal. It's about as liberal as you can get. Right in the heart of this very conservative area of the country, but an extremely liberal campus. Huge campus. And beautiful, by the way. So I met all these Christians there, and the Lord surrounded me with this great network of friends. And through that time, I was able to, I switched from pre-med to just planning to go for my doctorate and teach. And I was working on that doctorate when I met a man calling himself Mr. Otis online. He sent me an email because his marriage had broken up. He was alone. He had a 7-year-old daughter, and he was trying to find friends. I was on Match.com with him because I was an older student. The young students that I tended to meet who were single very often were actually, in a way, under my charge, because I either was teaching them directly or they were taking lessons from me on the side. I was running diagnostic equipment that I actually taught to many of the kids, and doing research as one of the co-researchers with the doctors there. So I couldn't really legally date any of these kids, any of the students. So I just thought, I'm just going to find someone that gets me online. And he got me. I mean, Derek Gilbert gets me down to the molecular level. He was, even though he is 10 years younger than I am, it's like the Lord created us for each other in separate time streams. And it took all of that time, my various periods of life, until I finally got to the Derek period. And that's where I've spent the last 15 and a half years, and I have been the happiest woman on this earth.
I love that. I absolutely love that because, you certainly don't see a lot of husband and wife couples where there's just an equal share of what the two of you do. For example, with PID radio, you see some ministries where you've got the man, he's like the main voice, and then you've got the wife who comes forward every once in a while and says a couple words to support her husband and then steps back into the shadows. But the two of you have such a partnership that just comes through with what you do on the radio and in, various online forums. And it's just such a wonderful example to me, and I'm sure to so many other people, of what just a loving partnership should be in a marriage. And it's obvious that the two of you just really get each other. And, it's interesting as I listen to you tell the story. I'm so glad you told it the way you did, because I was pulling things out of it that I can say it's interesting how much you and I have in common. I mean, just hearing the story, obviously my path diverged probably much deeper into the New Age and the occult before I came back around. But, not only do we have the music in common, I definitely was into this singing world for quite a while. I didn't do it on quite the same scale, but I did a lot of wedding singing and that kind of thing.
I've done a ton of that.
Which is always really fun and rewarding in its own way, but very difficult to make a career out of. And just through, orchestra and symphony and that kind of thing. But then also just hearing you talk about how you had this perception of the supernatural realm and how it's kind of difficult to find a church fellowship where that type of thing is discussed, and how that type of thing in some cases isn't just outright frowned upon to even bring up.
Oh dear. Yeah.
As
the eyes would roll.
Right. Yeah, and I found that time and time again. And also, just when you mention about how the the Lord just kept putting these Christian fellowships in your path. Now, when I talk about my testimony, it probably is remiss on my part that I don't mention often, but it's definitely true throughout all of the things that I went through, going astray and getting involved in all this weird stuff. I too continually had these people put in my path that I believe maybe it didn't necessarily impact me in that moment, but it kept me close enough to the Lord to have a little window of my heart open. I got out of high school and was in extreme rebellion, and I ended up meeting this wonderful girl named Michelle who became my roommate, and she was a very devout Christian, and I would go to church with her sometimes in different groups and stuff, and my heart wasn't 100% in it, but it seems like there was always this, almost just like we could call it like a cosmic reminder, like this is something that just continually came back into my realm, even as I was, for me personally, I was trying to push it away. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know about it, but it was just, God was always sort of there, just like, I'm here when you're ready. I'm here when you need me, So it's interesting to hear that, you kept finding yourself in these situations where, different groups of Christians were around you and kind of keeping you grounded and on that track. Isn't it just amazing how God works? I mean, when we just sit and think about how, sometimes I think when things get difficult in our lives and we're faced with different troubles, sometimes God can feel really far away, but when we're really looking at our lives and the courses that it takes, he's actually so close all the time. He's just right there, and it's more us who pull away from the relationship, if that makes any sense. We put the distance in place. He's the one who's constantly trying to get close to us.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. When I was singing in bands in Indianapolis, I really loved doing that. I'll be honest with you. I really loved doing that. But I knew that it was not following the path that the Lord wanted for me. I in and of itself, singing, popular music isn't necessarily an evil thing.
Mm-hmm.
But using a gift that He gave me for His glory, using the time on earth that He had given to me to serve Him, especially when I had promised Him when I was very young that I would spend my life in ministry, He kept reminding me. And it was this little tap on the shoulder sometimes. You could almost feel, and like you say, He's there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, oh, can I talk to you about this later? Because right now I'm really having a good time, and I'm only going to be young once. I think one of the big sort of kicks in the head for me was, I think it was around 1977 or 78, somewhere in there. This talent agency, Talent Scouts, came to see me, and they wanted me to fly down to Nashville, Tennessee, and do some recordings. And I did. I flew down to Nashville, Tennessee, and I did some recordings. And I sat in meetings, about going into, believe it or not, country music. Because they thought that I had this great voice for country music. And I remember I went to several clubs with them and sat in with the bands that were there. And it all seemed kind of cool. But when I went back to my hotel room those nights, each time I would think, this isn't right. I'm not supposed to do this. And, the little devil on my shoulder would go, yeah, but if you make a lot of money, you can really help your mom and dad out because they don't have a whole lot of money, and you can buy them a new house, and you can blah, blah, blah. And I had these, rationalizations that I was making in my mind, thinking, that really could work. Well, when I got back to Indianapolis, and I had headshots taken at a professional photo place, the whole thing. I got back to Indianapolis, and I'd been praying about it, and really seriously talking to the Lord about it, not avoiding His presence over it. And He made it really clear that I had to say no. And so I did. My family, my friends, my bandmates all thought I was crazy because they were going to get to go with me. Now, I tell you what, I was not very popular there for a while. But I look back on my life and I realized I probably would be dead now. Or I would be an entirely different person if I were still alive, had I made that choice. And I really credit the Lord with that. He had other plans in mind for me. He doesn't have to use me to do these things. He could have just let me wander off on my own back then and do stupid things, probably get into all sorts of trouble, and, as they say, die very young, probably drug addict and who knows what else, because I'll tell you what, the music industry it will just eat you up.
Right.
And I'm so glad that He helped me to make a good choice back then.
Right. And it's just so interesting that how you can look back and it's all so clear, but there are so, even now, even as a Christian, I have to confess, I still find myself in situations where I have to make these decisions like, okay, now this might be this might be a decision that personally advances me more. This might be the decision that gets me a little bit more acclaim or money. And, think of all the good, that's that devil on your shoulder too. Think of all the good you could do with that money. It's like he's manipulating you. And then the other side is, well, yes, but is that really going to be for His glory? Is that really the right decision? And so it's still a struggle, even when you become a Christian, to constantly have to make those decisions and that type of thing. So I'm so thankful to have that now, where I can go to take it to the Lord in prayer, and He'll help sort all of that out so that the decisions that you make are the right ones, or at least to the best of your ability to make the right decisions. And of course, we all stumble occasionally, or we make a boneheaded decision here and there. And
I spend half my day flat on my face. I just make the worst decisions some days.
I do too, and you thank God for grace, right?
Amen.
Well,
isn't it wonderful, though, Natalina, that He looked at you, and He looked at me, and He looked at Derek, and so many of us, and for His glory, he chose to work through our lives, because he doesn't need us.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, because he has chosen to do that, it's made a mountain of difference in my life and yours, from what it sounds like.
Absolutely. And no question. In fact, it's true that there are things that I put behind me and things that you put behind you that probably could have, in this world, advanced our personal cause to different levels of success. But at the same time, I can say for me personally, the minute that I accepted Jesus and that I decided to take what I had created and use it for His glory, the doors just start to open and things become more clear. And like I said, that's when I finally decided to do a radio show, and that's when I felt like I was kind of doing what I was created to do, and things just, it's like this light comes on in your life, and everything makes more sense, and it is easier to make those decisions, and it's also easier to get back up when you make the wrong ones. It's easier to say, okay, well, I obviously am forgiven. I obviously can move forward from this and learn from this. It's so amazing when you take it upon yourself to recognize that it's not about you,
right?
And everything just kind of, the fog lifts, I guess, is the best way that I can describe it. It's like there's this new purpose in your life, and you realize it's not just a purpose that you chose, but it's a purpose that He created you for, to glorify Him.
Amen to that. Well said. To me, it's like when I put on my glasses. I wore glasses as a kid, little nerd kid, and then when I got older, I was able to do without them for quite a long time. And as I've gotten much older now, I find that I'm back wearing them. And if I don't have them on to read, the whole world looks really fuzzy. It's the same world. It hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
But when I put my glasses on, I suddenly see the truth. Scripture is like that.
Right.
If you have your scripture glasses on, you can see the truth in what's going on in the world, and it changes you. And it should. Because if scripture isn't changing you, then you're not really reading it.
Absolutely. And it's something that becomes this drive, this desire that's in you to get deeper into it, to learn more about it, because it brings you closer and closer in that relationship. And also that's a really good example of just how we perceive the world now, as though we have these other glasses on. You and Derek focus a lot on current events on PID radio, and even as we record this episode, there is so much going on in this world right now that sometimes it's just overwhelming. You don't even know where to look. Right now, before we even started, I had the TV on, and we're seeing the aftermath of this new series of riots in Ferguson, Missouri, and it was of course it was announced that a jury opted not to indict Officer Darren Wilson on charges resulting from the shooting of Michael Brown back in August, I think it was, all the way back in.
Yeah.
And I know you have a daughter who lives in the St. Louis area, so this literally hits close to home for you. What do you think about what's going on in Ferguson? It's part of a larger problem in this country, I think.
Well, it reminds me of many other times in my life so far that I've lived through periods of restlessness in the United States. When I was growing up in the 60s, there were Vietnam protests everywhere, and there were civil rights protests, lots of places. In fact, the governor of Missouri is named Nixon, and when I was in after high school, President Nixon ordered the National Guard in because of the Kent State protests against Vietnam. And the National Guard ended up shooting several students. I think there were 10 that were wounded and 4 who were killed.
Right.
They were all white.
Yeah.
If that were to take place today, and they were all white, again, I'm not so sure we get as much traction. There's a curious thing. I don't know how familiar you are with Charles Manson.
Mm-hmm.
But one of his really core beliefs, according to his own book and books about him, is that he really believed that the government was going to incite a race war
Yeah, helter-skelter.
Exactly. And that at the end of it, the blacks would be subjugated to white authority. And Charles Manson believed that if he participated in that he would be rewarded at the end of it and be given a position of authority. I think he was about 40 years ahead because he thought it was going to take place in the late 60s, early 70s. 40 years later, here we are 40 plus years later, here we are looking at what's going on in St. Louis, Missouri, and that's sort of the heart of America. Yeah. St. Louis is an area that is traditionally, despite, the fact that it's heavily Democratic, the Democrats there tend to be more conservative than Democrats elsewhere. So it's a relatively conservative town, a high Catholic population in St. Louis. When we lived there, we lived in West County, St. Louis. Ferguson is more in North County. It's closer to the airport, and it's in an area of the county that's a little bit poorer. West County was a little more affluent. We were the white trash people living in an affluent area of West County. But the area of Ferguson has been trying to make a progression toward being a more beautiful town as far as the way that they've just set up street lamps and things like that. They've been trying to restore a lot of the homes there. In other words, they've been trying to make their property values go up and their general way of life much more pleasant for the people living in Ferguson. In fact, Derek and I, a couple of years ago, were thinking about moving back to St. Louis to be closer to Nicole. Her mother had moved to Indiana, so Nicole we were concerned that she was feeling detached from family, so we thought, well, we'll move back there. And we honestly were looking at the Ferguson area because it was an up-and-coming part of St. Louis County. Affordable houses, relatively safe. Not anymore. Not anymore. And we have people in our church whose daughter and her husband live in Ferguson. So I don't really know if they've been affected or not, but what kills me about this is that an event that who knows the real truth? God only knows the real truth of what happened. Because even Darren Wilson, we all tend to confabulate when we take a look at retrograde in memories, and oftentimes things that we're sure happened become part of fact to us.
Right.
So his memory may or may not be 100% accurate. Based on the evidence, it sounds like he was just defending himself in his patrol car. But regardless of that, even if the evidence had shown that he, in no way, shape, or form was he at fault, I think we would still be seeing rioting in Ferguson, because it is important to an overarching plan that is in place to ruin the United States of America, to so destroy us that we no longer have a power base. Then that is part of the order out of chaos, which is the overarching, if you want to call it the Illuminati plan or the powers that be plan. Mm-hmm. The plan. It is essentially the supernatural realms plan, the spiritual enemies of God. They seek to bring about a new world order in order to have that moment again of Babylon, that moment where the whole world is focusing on one goal, and that goal being to battle Jesus Christ when he tries to come back.
And you can see so much of this when the blinders are off and you're watching all of this unfold. I think back to August when the first series of unrest started happening in Ferguson, and it was, it's hard to recall now, but the meme at the time was this overreaching militarized police presence against these innocent protesters who were just, for the most part, being very peaceful and organized. And I remember that was very much the thrust of what was reported. But now, when we look at the wake of what happened just overnight, and we're seeing how these, quote, protesters have burned entire city blocks down and crushed police cars, and, there was this tragic story that I read today of this woman who had, worked her whole life to build this small business. And of course, it's not like you're seeing Walmarts being burned down. You're seeing, these small storefronts that tend to rise up in urban centers that are getting destroyed. And these are the result of people's, life's work and their dreams and just being crushed. And I say, such chaos. If your goal here was to prove that there is this unwarranted violence against a certain people group, then I just have the hardest time understanding how this manifestation of rioting is proving that to be incorrect, right? And it also when you watch just in the days leading up to this, as the jury was out, the media so insidiously was planting these seeds of there might be some riots, the tension is building, almost as though it was desperately wanting to see this happen because it would make such good news and it would further this agenda that you're speaking about, that, even if there were people who were planning on just peacefully protesting, the media kind of pushed them more in the direction of a violent uprising. And I'm not saying that the media is 100% to blame for what happened, but there is a certain level of where you can see this larger collusion to make what happened last night happen.
Oh, I agree. The mainstream media feeds on the despair of others. Mm-hmm. When you have a 24/7 news cycle, they run out of things to talk about. I mean, there are a lot of things going on in the world that the reporters could talk about if they chose to. I mean, there are atrocities going on all over. There are wonderful things happening all over. Any given day, there were probably, 100 million or more news stories that they could investigate. But when something like this comes along, it becomes a no-brainer. Right. We get to run this hour after hour after hour, day after day after day. And if they don't continue to fan those flames, then the fire dies out. And then they have to find the next big story that they can run. Mm-hmm. What killed me is I was watching a video of some CNN people who were on the street in Ferguson, and one of them was wearing a gas mask because there was tear gas in the area, and he suddenly removed his gas mask. He said later on, well, it wasn't fitting tightly, and they removed it, and he instantly, of course, started tearing up and choking and was barely able to talk, and I think that was all theater.
Yeah. He
took off that gas mask. He was probably told by his producer, take off your gas mask. Because we want to be able to later say on, have you crying and this and that, and play it up all the more. There was also, I think, another CNN person who was hit in the head with a bottle, I think. Mm. And so we see her video and pictures over and over today of her bleeding forehead. This reaction, I'll call it that to be just gentle, is taking place not just in Ferguson, it's throughout major cities all over the country, even in Europe and other countries. They're reacting to the injustice of the United States that dares to come to other countries and say you are in violation of civil rights, when in fact we ourselves are so guilty.
Yeah. In fact, this is an interesting point, and I haven't read the full article, but are you familiar with Matt Walsh, the blogger Matt Walsh?
No.
He has this blog, I think it's just the Matt Walsh blog, and he is a conservative writer, but he also he tends to focus on issues of importance to conservatives and Christians, and he's also very no holds barred. He gets in a lot of trouble because he just says it like it is. He wrote an article today about what happened in Ferguson, and he makes a really strong point that these protesters, as they are marching for justice and they're asking for justice, he said the part that is being forgotten is that justice happened. the way it is supposed to, that a jury of his peers looked at the evidence that was presented to them and came to the decision that he was not to be indicted based upon what was presented to them. That is how our justice system works. You don't have to agree with it, but really what is obvious is that they're not looking for justice. They're looking for revenge. They're looking for retribution in this situation. And this line of what actually is justice and what we have built this country on is not really what anyone's interested anymore. We don't want justice to be served the way it was designed. We want justice to be served for our own pet interests.
Well, you're absolutely right. And they're defining justice according to what they choose the outcome to be. I believe with all my heart that they are going to approach the federal government and ask that Darren Wilson be prosecuted by the federal government on civil rights charges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see it happening. And, of course, the administration that we currently have, it would be very sympathetic to that. And, you know, even with just this recent situation with President Obama and his immigration speech that he gave and the reforms, quote, reforms that he's been putting into place, it is all part of this larger story that's being told of changing fundamentally what it is to what the United States began as, and then of course as a larger picture, it is a rebellion. It's interesting because I find that when you say things like that, I even find myself, there's certain parts of me, because let me tell you a little secret, Sharon, I used to be a bleeding heart liberal. This is a true confession. I said this probably in my first podcast, and so many people were upset to hear it, but all I can do is just be honest. As recently as 2008, I campaigned for Barack Obama. I worked for his campaign. I was an organizer, and you know, I have to stress that the reasons that I was so passionate about it at that time were my heart was in the right place. I bought the line that the Democrats were the ones who cared about homelessness. The Democrats were the ones who cared about people. And of course, Obama, he was so slick, and he would even use biblical phrases about being your brother's keeper, you know, and
does that.
It hit me for the things that I cared about at that time, and it wasn't until late, you know, a couple of years later. Well, I wouldn't even say a couple of years later. It was like the day after he got elected that I had all of this buyer's remorse that I dealt with, and you can see how this has unraveled to the point where I'm not the only one, you know. I mean, so many people, even who would have the propensity to always defend the liberal cause or the Democratic cause, are defecting from this administration because it's so outrageous what they're trying to do to the very fabric of our country.
It's disheartening to watch it, isn't it? You know, what really killed me years ago was because I was raised a Democrat, because that area of the country, we're talking about the old school Democrats. Yeah. We're very conservative and very labor unions driven. My parents were Democrats because they believed that was the party that was really going to help them out, because that's what you do. You find a party that you believe, you know, gets you and is in, you know, doing things to help you, and that's how you vote. When I got a little bit older, I started to realize, you know, maybe my beliefs are a little more Republican and conservative than that, because I've been raised in a very conservative atmosphere. It was just we were Democrats. I've learned now that it doesn't matter what the label is. The politicians are all on the same side.
Yeah.
If you make it, it's rare, it is extremely rare to make it all the way to Washington, D.C. as a politician and be able to say you have not compromised yourself somewhere along the line, and that you are not indebted to people who will tell you how to vote.
Right.
So if you're in Washington, D.C., you're really not representing your constituents so much as you're representing your investors.
Yeah. Isn't that the truth? And I think that's where I sort of rested, to where I realized that it's just like the mafia, where there's warring families, but no one's innocent. You know?
No one's mattresses.
Exactly. It's funny because, you know, and then I kind of fall into this place where I find myself almost apathetic about politics in general, and yet there is this need for us as Christians to speak out about the things that are going on in the world. And, you know, with stories like Ferguson that are leading the headlines now, and the immigration thing, the story that captivated the world not even 2 months ago, and that being Ebola, has kind of been relegated to this sidebar discussion, and it leads some to think that it's no longer a problem, the threat is over. But the facts just tell a different story. But why do you think something like Ebola has become sort of old news when it was something that just preoccupied every news story so recently?
You know, that's true of many news stories, though, because the day's going to come when we're all just going to go, Ferguson, huh? Mm-hmm. Because it'll be gone. Right. Ebola was being trumpeted as a major threat to the United States, and I do think that it is still a threat, not only to West Africa, but to any country that could receive someone flying in. You know, the United States is not barring anybody from West Africa from flying here. We're still issuing visas. We're just, you know, supposedly checking them out. Do you have a fever? Would you fill this form out? Oh, you do have a fever. Well, let's make sure, you know, but we can't quarantine you because that one nurse got really mad, so we can't really do that. It seems to have just disappeared, and it disappeared at about the same time that a lawyer was put in charge. Do you think maybe that's a coincidence, or is it possible that some mainstream media outlets received phone calls or emails saying no more Ebola stories?
Yeah.
And let me tell you why I think that may be true. It's not a very economic result to have Ebola in the news constantly, and people thinking, I don't dare go out and be around strangers when you're supposed to be out shopping for Christmas.
Uh-huh. That makes sense. Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that I heard, it was either the mayor of Ferguson or the governor of Missouri. I can't remember which, because I wasn't watching the video at the time. I was doing something else and listening. But he said, please, the best thing you can do, it reminded me of George Bush after 9/11, the best thing you can do is go out and go ahead to your shopping malls, support your local business people, go ahead and shop, just act as if nothing has happened.
Isn't that interesting? That's exactly what George Bush, you know, go to Disneyland.
It's exactly right. And they do not want the economy to suddenly flounder because there's a story out there that may keep people away from the stores. Mm-hmm. I think that after Christmas has passed and we get to January, and which tends to be a really low news cycle anyway, I think Ebola may come back in the news. And I hope it's not because someone has flown over here and suddenly there is a small outbreak in a state. I really don't want to see that. But I just saw a story from the UN saying that their plan to have, I think it was 70% of the people with current Ebola diagnosis in a hospital bed by December 1. That hasn't happened. So they have already admitted they have failed in their goals for West Africa. The numbers of the infected are still rising every day in Sierra Leone. They are starting to rise in Mali. They've had 6 people die there, and there are 300 people they're monitoring who were around those 6 people. So this is an area, and you know, again, coincidence that the outbreak in Mali, which was totally unexpected according to Mali authorities, occurred within weeks after a vaccine trial started there.
Yeah, coincidence.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it seemed like it fell out of the news quickly, like with the snap of a finger. And I was doing some research, knowing that I was going to be interviewing you about this, and I came upon this story that just came out, in the past couple of days. And it was a very, I'll have to find it and put it in the show notes. I think it was a BBC article. And I'm going to paraphrase some of it, but just from memory, but it was a very confusing article because it had about 3 tracks of thought into it. It started out by saying, we're getting Ebola under control and it's not the threat that we thought it was going to be. And then the second part of the article was, hold on, it's still a really big deal. And they quoted an expert who said that there are still at least, and this is just the reported numbers, of course, at least 1,000 new cases of Ebola every week. And what that amounts to is that every fortnight, which I had to look up to see exactly how long that was, 2 weeks, there are more Ebola cases reported than the entirety of each previous Ebola outbreak on record.
Yes.
That's very sobering.
Yeah. In the past, and there have been, I think, maybe 10 or other, something like that, outbreaks of Ebola, mainly in Central and Eastern Africa. These have been relatively small, where the deaths have been less than 100 people in most cases. Sometimes maybe only a dozen people. The West Africa outbreak is not only huge numbers, but they think it is underreported by 1/3. In other words, they think, maybe I put that poorly, they think the numbers are actually 3 times what they're actually seeing. Because the people there some of them believe that Ebola is spread by going to the hospital, so they won't go.
Right. And you point out in your book, I want to transition in talking about your book too. You point out in your book that see if I get this right, the initial reported Ebola outbreak was largely a result of people going to the hospital, but not for Ebola, but they were getting injected for other things, and this virus was being transmitted to them unknowingly just through improperly sterilized needles. So they kind of have a reason to fear going to the hospital.
Well, exactly. That was the Yambuku outbreak in 1976, and it was just determined later on. The women of the area, and it may still be true in many African small villages, that the men go into the large towns to work during the week, so the women are left at home to take care of the kids by themselves. And if they're pregnant, and they often are, they really need to keep working, tilling the soil, getting water. It's a very, very hard physical existence. And especially if they have young children who can't really help yet, the women were going in for vitamin B shots. So they were weekly getting injections, and they would line up by the hundreds every day for these shots. And the nurses at this little village hospital, this little Belgian hospital, only had 5 needles. That was it. It had 5 needles that they kept cleaning over and over again. But when you have 100 or more people lined up, you can't just stop and clean everything the way it should be. And so it would get contaminated or not cleaned properly. And if they did have Ebola, they were taking it from one arm to another, to another, to another.
I found that to be so interesting because I hadn't really thought about the fact that that there's so many different factors that come into play with the spread of this type of thing. And of course, you and I in private conversations I've expressed to you that I have this interest in viruses and outbreaks because it is something it's fascinating. Before we get into really the heart of your book, I want you to describe what a virus is, like what the mechanics of a virus, because it's not really something that's alive, is it? I mean, that's just so interesting to me. What is it?
Well, right now with transhumanism and nanotechnology, mankind scientists are trying to find ways to create molecular machines that will go in and cure diseases and make us all live longer and we'll all be happy and, essentially bypass the need for salvation is really where they're going with transhumanism. But viruses in many ways are early, and we're talking the dawn of man. They think there are scientists who say that Ebola virus is probably 100,000 years old or older. Now, that's looking at their time stream. That's not a biblical worldview. They're looking at it through the eyes of someone who believes in evolution. Right. But in other words, it's been around for a long time. They're really like little molecular machines. Viruses are not like bacteria. They're not alive. They don't reproduce on their own. They can only do so by hijacking a host cell and forcing the host cell's replication and translation machinery within the nucleus and within the mitochondria to make copies of themselves. And in so doing, they essentially ruin the cell, because in order to get out, they break their way out. They disrupt the cell entirely. And so they leave destruction in their wake. And some viruses not only leave destruction in their wake, they sometimes will not kill the cell right away, but they will leave little pieces of their DNA or RNA, depending on what it is, inside the cell, so that it actually changes us from the inside out.
It freaks me out, because I think, like, when you think of a virus, our mind, what we know, what the layperson knows about them, you just presume it is like a little bacteria, it's like a little living organism, but it's not. It's something so much more insidious. And obviously your academic work, it's given you a unique perspective on viral outbreaks, and then coupling that with your interest in biblical prophecy, your book, Ebola and the Fourth Horseman of the Apocalypse, is something really unique in that it's written by someone who has this expertise and interest in both realms. What inspired you to write this book?
I have been watching pathogens for a long time. I've been of the opinion since I was first learning about biblical prophecy that eventually we would have a worldwide pandemic that would take out 25% of the population of the world, because that's what we see in Revelation chapter 6. The fourth horseman is given authority to kill 25% of humanity. The description of his ride is very much like a pandemic taking place in the world. He follows the first three riders, and I think it's important that we sort of take them as the quartet that they are. The first rider is the ruler. He's the one who has the crown, and he's given a great sword. And he's given a bow, and it's a picture of someone who is stepping to the stage politically and saying, "I'll take care of all your problems." The next person follows, and that's sort of the muscle behind the first guy. This is the warrior who will, if you don't, fall into line because you like me, will force you to fall into line. Mm-hmm. And the third person is the economic control. The verb that is, not the verb, but the noun that is often translated as, what's the word? The legal, and he holds suddenly just brain, isn't it?
A scale.
A scale, thank you very much. Can also mean a yoke. Mm-hmm. Think about it. A scale is shaped like a yoke that goes over two oxen who are forced to work together. The yoke is to me very much like fascism. Fascism is technically a political system that binds people together, one ring to rule them all, sort of way to take care of humanity. A yoke forces you to into slavery in many ways. So the third horseman is coming in with an economic worldview that says, if you don't subscribe to the mark, you won't get to bank, you won't get to buy. The fourth rider comes along after all of this devastation that has totally disrupted the world system and leading into the New World Order. He takes out 25% of humanity. So suddenly the population control has been, the demand for fewer people has taken place. And I would bet at the end of that ride that there are many people in the world that will say, great, boy, didn't need them. Yeah. So glad they're gone, because now we've got fewer people to control. Fewer people for the few resources that we have.
we obviously hear about this theme of population control throughout those of us who study what the New World Order means and what their aims are and what their goals are. And, it is definitely feasible to say that one of the most efficient ways to achieve that end would be a worldwide pandemic of some sort. And you refer to Ebola in your book as a blood snake or a blood serpent, and this is partly based on its shape, but there's more to it. Explain how you came to use this terminology and what specifically that role you theorized that Ebola might play in this whole scene that you just laid out.
Well, Ebola is only one of many pathogens that could be the one or a combination of pathogens that eventually take out 25% of mankind. But it is referred to by people who do this for a living. Virologists looking at it through a microscope will often shout, I've got worms, I've got snakes, because that's the shape of the virus. Most viruses are spherical in shape. Ebola is curvilinear. It is sort of snake-shaped.
Right.
And it's out for your blood. And to me, that is a sign of sacrifice. The spiritual enemy wants human blood to be shed all over this earth. That is part of a sacrifice. That's part of, you and I, we've done enough, and I not as much as you, but we know enough about the occult world to know that there are certain requirements and rituals that have to take place in order to usher in permission for the enemy to have access to us, or to open a gateway. I believe that human sacrifice is one of those events. Blood must be shed for the spiritual gods to be satisfied and to be given access to humanity. The very fact that Ebola tends to make us bleed so much because it has a propensity for and an affinity for epithelial cells, which line all of our blood vessels and the various organs, so that when those break down, we naturally bleed right underneath our skin. Sometimes in diseases like this, smallpox is another one that will cause you to bleed out in a form of it that's called blackpox. Sometimes in blackpox, the bleeding underneath the skin is so severe that the skin itself actually sloughs off. It's a terrible way to die.
You know what it makes me think of, Sharon? This is a tangent a little bit, but you and I have both been watching that show Helix.
Yeah.
On Netflix.
I've seen it all the way through. Have you watched it all the way through?
I have a couple of episodes left, but it has gone from kind of a little cheesy to being really fascinating, and just a lot of the implications of what they touch on in this show. For anyone out there who wants to check it out, it's on Netflix, the whole first season. A lot of what they touch on in the show really kind of tracks with the research that you've done, because they touch on things like population control. What happens when there's this repository of all of these deadly diseases that the people with not so savory intentions could get their hands on, and also just the idea of the way these people succumb to this illness in that show. They bleed out, they become it's really gross, but it's something that as I look at what you describe that happens to people with Ebola, of course this is maybe a bit more of an exaggerated version, but it kind of tracks. It's almost as though the people who made the show must have studied that and sort of used some of that to imagine what might happen with this super deadly contagion.
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. I also think that there are times when the enemy simply whispers into someone's ear and says, here's an idea.
Yeah.
And because you see the same ideas repeated over and over again. One of my favorite shows that Derek and I have talked about so many times is called Millennium.
Yeah.
And sadly, it's really hard to watch it because you can't find it streaming anywhere. So unless you can get the DVD set, you're unlikely to be able to see it. But we do have the DVD set, so we watch the episodes over and over. But there's an episode where the Millennium Group, which at this point Frank Black is starting to find out maybe they're not everything he thought they were, they vaccinate him against his will against a virus that is a chimera virus. It's several viruses that have been incorporated into each other so that you get very easy spread, communicability between humans. So I could easily spread it to someone in the same room as me. And it causes you to bleed from every orifice, just like Ebola does, but even worse. He was vaccinated against it, but his family was not. He was told only members get to be vaccinated. And the entire upper northwest of the United States was the testing ground for this vaccine, for the virus. And a lot of people died as a result of it, but Frank survived, as did all the members of the Millennium Group. But he found out later, of course, it was just a test. I think what we're seeing now is just a test. I think we're seeing a forerunner from the spiritual realm, a sort of a practice ride of the riders. Jesus himself told us that we would experience what he described as birth pangs. In my book, I say that I believe that what we're going through now are what doctors call Braxton Hicks contractions. They feel like the real thing. They're not quite as bad as the real thing, but there's no baby coming yet.
Right.
Go home, he would tell the mother. You're just having contractions that often hit 5-6 weeks before the baby's actually due. There's a baby coming, and it's not going to be a good experience because the enemy wants to give birth to his seed the same way that the Lord sent his own seed, Jesus Christ, on earth to die for us. The enemy is going to ask not that he will die for us. He wants us to die for him.
Mm-hmm. You alluded to it a little bit ago, but also in your book, you're very careful to say that this is not necessarily a theory that you're putting forward as true, but that there is reason to at least consider the coincidental, in air quotes, nature of how some of this came about. You even point out that the first incidents of Ebola kind of coincided with the AIDS epidemic, and from the same place in Africa, in Zaire, I believe, right? And that there is, I did not realize that was the timing and the placement was the exact same thing. It makes one consider, when you think about the placement of these different research hospitals and how they're connected to the places where these epidemics emerge from, that there could be reason to suspect that there is a hand of collusion in making these things come into being, if I worded that correctly, that there's a reason to suspect, or at least keep an eye on the idea that perhaps these aren't just 100% naturally occurring situations.
Well, I think that's definitely a possibility. And again, I want to make sure that people understand that I'm not saying that's what happened. Mm-hmm. I just find it interesting that these emerged at about the same time, in about the same area, at a time when Western companies were starting to experiment with various vaccines in the area. In fact, in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, just shortly before the outbreak in West Africa began, there was a program that had been in place for several years, a partnership between Fort Detrick, which is the National Institutes of Health, and Tulane University to try to find a Lassa virus vaccine. Lassa is a cousin to Ebola, and they were also experimenting with Ebola in that area. And you have to wonder, is it possible that something got out and they're simply not willing to admit it? Because the viruses, there's a line in the movie Jurassic Park where the one scientist says, Yes, but nature will always find a way. Well,
right.
The enemy will always find a way. If there's a way to get, if the goal is to take out humanity, he'll find a way to do it, and he'll often use humans to that end. You mentioned earlier that there are repositories of viruses throughout the world. There are only really supposed to be 2 locations where those viruses, very dangerous viruses on the BSL-4 laboratory level, where they are so deadly that they're considered weapons of mass destruction. Only Russia and the United States have repositories of those, and the reason that we kept them when we signed the ban on biological weapons, we said we need to research them and make sure that if someone does come along and has a weaponized version of this, that we'll know how to combat it.
You know what it makes me think of is the Plum Island situation with Lyme disease, and how now, and it's something that I had actually written about a couple of years ago, and about there is this idea that perhaps Lyme disease wasn't something that necessarily naturally occurred, but that it had escaped from the Plum Island research facility. And what really is frightening now is that they want to, I haven't looked at this in a long time, but the last that I had read about it was that they wanted to move that facility into like Kansas, into the heart of farm country. Am I right about remembering that?
Absolutely. When Derek and I were living in Columbia, Missouri, Columbia, Missouri was one of the potential sites for the Banff facility. Banff? Yeah,
sounds right.
Something like that. Not as in Banff, Canada, but it was a biological facility to study animal diseases, and we felt that would be a very dangerous thing to be doing, because they wanted to locate it right next to an elementary school and to a horse farm. And we just said, Derek was on the air at the time in a radio station, and he said over and over on his show, this is a bad idea, and I'm so glad that Columbia finally voted it down. But it did get approved for, is it Manhattan, Kansas area? Yeah. Anyway, it's in Kansas, and I don't know that they've even broken ground on it. I keep reading, trying to see where that is yet, if it's even been built, but I don't think it's been built yet. The plan is to close Plum Island and move everything to this new facility. But they want to move the facility to the middle of farm country. Plum Island at least was, away from us, and the wind was blowing out to sea.
Right. So
the chances of something coming over accidentally were relatively small. But if you put it in the middle of farm country, hoof and mouth and all sorts of terrible diseases, they're animal diseases, could just suddenly go through our population of animals like a knife through butter.
Right. When you look at the history of Plum Island, too, there is just one mishap after the other that is just part of the record. It's not conspiracy theory. It's outbreaks of hoof and mouth amongst the employees, and then taking that out into, their communities and this type of thing. And so it's not beyond the pale to imagine that something could come out and what that would mean for our food supply. You think about how, of course, we need to study these things. We need scientists who are working on finding cures for these viruses, and I suppose that there is need to have the actual viruses on hand to study them, but it makes you wonder, how many lines are we crossing when we just have these killer diseases available to us, and we rely on our own human ingenuity, and we kind of forget the human error aspect of it, and we think that we're so safe, and we think that nothing like this could ever get out, but history has shown that that's not always the case. It is something to be concerned about.
Well, I can tell you that the scientists with whom I worked at Indiana University are probably typical of most researchers, in that they simply love to learn, they're fascinated by their subject matter, and they're extremely curious. And so if you find you're able to do something, then you probably will do that something just to see what happens. I walked into one of my genetics classes one day, and the professor, as we all got in there, he put up his hands. He says, "Everybody stop." And so we all stood really still, and we said, "What?" He said, "Don't anybody move. If you see a fly, don't hit it. Don't kill it. Because the flies from lab number whatever have all gotten out, and these were flies that had been manipulated when they were just, growing in the egg as to become pseudopodia flies. They had feet on their heads. These were very important flies to the research going on, and it was under a government grant, so these were very precious little flies. That's the kind of thing. I mean, if you're able to put feet on the head of a fly, it's the kind of curiosity that well-intended, well-meaning, loving people become so focused on their subject matter that it's really easy to forget the what-ifs and ignore them.
Sharon, what is the difference? I tend to use these words interchangeably, and I think that I don't know what the difference is. What's the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic?
An epidemic is local. A pandemic is worldwide.
Okay. I find myself just haphazardly using both of them to mean the same thing.
Most people consider, technically epidemic is actually not technically local only. Local only is referred to as endemic. It's a virus that lives within an area, and it's sort of like in Africa in many of the jungles. Ebola is endemic to those areas. It will always be there. It will never leave. When it jumps to another population close by, or it jumps to another species, it's then called an epidemic. But as I say, it's only a pandemic, pan meaning all, when everybody in the world, or most of the world countries have experienced, or when the World Health Organization comes in and says, we now have a pandemic.
One thing I want to talk about before I let you go, because we're getting close to the end here, but there's a really fascinating story in your book. It's interesting how history is written in such a way that we tend to believe that with this current Ebola outbreak, that this is the first time that any semblance of Ebola has ever come to American shores. And that's not actually true. There was an incident in Virginia where the Ebola virus had a sort of, on a much more micro scale, made its presence known in the U.S. What's that story about?
Had you ever heard of it before? When you read about it, had you ever heard of it?
I had, because I read The Hot Zone.
Yes.
But I forgot about it.
Well, yes, and I think that's true. See, something like that was so close to home, we tend to forget about it because there are other things that, matter, like the Ferguson thing today. We're all thinking about that. Back in 1991, I think it was, 91 or 92, there was a shipment of crab-eating monkeys, which are often, crab-eating monkeys are often used as test subjects for Ebola. They had come over from the Philippines, I think, and they were arriving here to go to various labs throughout the United States. And these 500 monkeys were in a holding facility in Reston, Virginia, because the law says they had to be there for 30 days to be observed and make sure they weren't bringing in any exotic diseases. Because if you're going to work on a monkey, you don't want him to be sick. So they were in this holding facility, and the most recent arrivees were in, I think, room F, and they started getting sick and dying. And I think Dr. Dalgard, I think was the name of the vet who was in charge of Reston, Virginia's, this holding facility. And he at first assumed that they were dying of some simian virus, and so he did an autopsy, or necropsy is what they're actually called on animals, and trying to determine what was going on, but he couldn't figure it out. So he called his buddies over at Fort Detrick. And the guys over there who were in charge at the time had great experience in Ebola, but they did not, in one shape or form, that not in the remotest ideas, did they think that this was anything like that. They were shocked when they found out that the monkeys had Ebola. But the thing about that incident is that it did show that Ebola is airborne, because the monkeys on one end of the building infected monkeys on the other end of the building, even though they were not in the same room. They were at extreme ends of the facility. And this was a relatively large office building. The thinking at the time was, or the assumption was, well, somehow the workers have carried the virus with them. But they checked all of their methodology, and they realized that that wasn't it. They finally determined, after much research, that the virus had actually gone through the ductwork and infected the monkeys in the other room through the air ducts.
Isn't that just... But then, of course, we're still told to this day, even though we have this evidence and we have this proof that this happened, that we're warned time and time again by the people in the mainstream media that there is no reason to suspect that you could get Ebola through airborne means. We're told this time and time again. The evidence suggests completely otherwise.
Well, this Ebola virus was slightly different in its genome than the Ebola virus that is in West Africa, which, by the way, is slightly different from the Ebola virus in Zaire. There are about a dozen types of Ebola, and the one that infected the monkeys in 1991 that's referred to as Ebola reston. I think it was three of the humans who were involved in the cleanup got sick, and the fear at the time was that they had caught the disease, but they had flu-like symptoms. One gentleman actually had a heart attack, which may have been caused by it, but may have just been coincidental to the event. But afterward, these three humans were tested, and they all had antibodies to Ebola in their bloodstream. So they had been exposed to it. But for whatever reason, at that time, at least that kind of Ebola didn't have a strong affinity for human lung tissue. It loved monkey lung tissue, loved it. Made them sick, made them die. But humans, for whatever reason, it wasn't very effective at infecting human lung cells. Now, lungs still have epithelial cells, but the thinking is there must have been something different about lung tissue in humans that kept that. I say it's the Lord. Mm-hmm. I think the Lord just stopped it, because had those humans actually gotten Ebola, it would have been crazy.
Yeah, especially just given how long it took them to figure out exactly what it was. I want to just have in your book, at the beginning and at the end, even though the subject matter that you discuss and all of the things that we've been talking about here tonight, they're scary. They're things that kind of fill us with this idea of, imagining the what ifs and this type of thing. And it's all important information to know. But as I said, at the beginning of your book and at the end and throughout, you remind people that there is hope, and that it is not something that we should live our lives in fear of. And I want you to speak to that, because you lay it out so eloquently in the book, and it's important. It's an important reminder at the tail end of a discussion like this.
Ultimately, we have to put our faith in either science or in God. I choose to put my faith in God, even though I love science and I've studied it for many years. My hope, my faith, my trust, my life belong to God. I know that anything that gets to me has to go through Him. And if He has allowed it, then it is for my education and for His glory. So I don't worry about those things that come my way. And if you love Him, if you believe Jesus Christ died for you, if He is your Savior, then you are in the palm of God's wonderful protective hand. Nothing gets to you without His permission. Put your faith in Him.
Amen. Amen. That's a great punctuation to this discussion, Sharon. If people want to get their hands on this book, I know you've got it available on your website. You've got it available on Amazon.com. What would you say is the best way for people to get in contact with you? Give us all your websites, and you've got a handful.
Well, let me just give you my personal website since we're talking about my book. It's just SharonKGilbert.com, SharonKGilbert.com. And if you go to there, you will see a link to buying the book. And you can buy it at Amazon. There is not a Kindle version yet, but there will be one later. I know that there's a reason, and I don't understand that. I'm not the publisher, but they try to give the paper copies a chance to be sold before they sell the electronic copies. But there will eventually be a Kindle version, so I'd look for that after Christmas probably. But for now, you can either go to the link at my website, or you can go to Raiders News Update, which has a link to buying it from Tom Horn's Survivor Mall location. You can get it at Amazon. You can probably get it in most of your bookstores. If you have a local bookstore, go, and if they have it there, great. If not, ask them to order it.
I want everybody to go out there and check that out. And then also the other books that you've written, the links are all on Sharon's website. I'll put links in the show notes. And I just want to say, Sharon, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been such a great discussion. It's been a long time coming, and I'm so honored that you took the time to talk to me today.
Natalina, I have just had the best time, and I think you and I should talk more, don't you think?
I think so. I think that is a very good idea.
We'll plan on it. And I pray the Lord blesses your ministry, honey.
Oh, thank you so much. Everybody, that was Sharon Gilbert, and you can find links to all of her wonderful materials, including PID Radio, her books that she's written, and she also blogs about current events on her website. Check that all out in the show notes.
You've been listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina. For the latest headlines and program schedule, please visit extraordinaryintelligence.com.